Hare Krishna. So we're continuing our Thursday night reading from Srila Prabhupada and Gurukula. We have finished the preface and introduction, and now we are finally into the book proper. So the first chapter is the importance. Now remember, these are quotes taken by the former Minister of Education in the 70s and 80s, His Holiness, formerly Jagadish Goswami. So they're quotes from Srila Prabhupada taken from books, lectures, conversations, letters from Srila Prabhupada about Gurukula education. So, and some of the quotes will have a kind of purport or comment by Jagadish Goswami. We'll go through those as well, just to get an understanding of his thinking on education and Gurukula in particular. So off we go. Quote number 1. This is taken from the purport of the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 3, text 21. Srila Prabhupada writes, "The king or the executive head of state, the father, and the school teacher are all considered to be natural leaders of the innocent people in general. All such natural leaders have a great responsibility to their dependents. Therefore, they must become conversant with standard books of moral and spiritual codes." Again, this is taken from Srila Prabhupada's purport, Bhagavad Gita, chapter 3, text 21. And this is the comment by Jagadish Goswami. This statement clearly substantiates the vital need for the Gurukula teachers to thoroughly and scrutinizingly study Srila Prabhupada's books. Besides the regular Bhagavad Gita and Srimad Bhagavatam classes in the temple, the Gurukula teachers should study a minimum of 2 hours per day. A Brahmana's main duties are to study and understand the Shastras, and then to teach others according to his spiritual realization on the subject matter. When I was in the Mayapur Gurukula and I wanted to take initiation, I had gone to the Gurukula teachers and stated my intent, and they said, well, first you have to show seriousness, you have to qualify for being a prefect. I was 16 years old at the time. So one of the things I had to do to qualify to be a prefect was reading, actually. I was told that I should dedicate a little time outside of my regular classes, Bhakti Shastra, whatever it was, to dedicate some time, an hour a day was mentioned, to reading just on my own. And that's when I took up the habit. It didn't become a habit at that age, but I was actually serious about becoming a prefect and then going on to get initiated. So I did begin, that began my, my practice of daily reading. Of course, thereafter, Srila Prabhupada's books and the teachings on Krishna consciousness are actually quite, enlivening and exciting. So it was very easy for that practice to begin to develop into a lifelong just enjoyment of, not all the time, not daily in a strict sense of the word of just reading, but researching it, studying Srila Prabhupada's books. I've always found it very, I'm always, as a teacher as well, I'm always preparing courses and classes, so reading has become a natural part of what I do. But I just remembered back when I was being developed and trained to be a prefect, reading was actually a key part of that training, actually. And actually, I'm going to be sharing this with some of our MVI Gurukula teachers, because this is actually a very good point, that as they become Gurukula teachers as well, their own daily reading, our own daily reading has to be continued. And this is actually one of the sadhana requirements of the Gurukula students, to read every day for 15 minutes, right? Some of these students are very young. Some of them, a couple of them are 5 and 6 years old. But to develop the habit of at least opening the book, Srila Prabhupada's books, and trying to muddle through and read and gather some understanding as much as they can at the young age that they are. Point number 2, or quote number 2. This quote is taken from the Ishopanishad, verse number 9, the purport to that verse. Srila Prabhupada writes, modern civilization has advanced considerably in the field of mass education, but the result is that people are more unhappy than ever before because of the stress placed on material advancement to the exclusion of the most important part of life, the spiritual aspect. Those who play the role of helping this sort of civilization in the name of educational advancement are actually doing more harm than those who are on the platform of gross sense gratification. That's interesting how Srila Prabhupada describes it. Those in educational advancement who are promoting this type of gross sense gratification are actually more dangerous than those who are just pursuing sense gratification in their own lives. Advancement of learning by a godless people is as dangerous as a valuable jewel on the hood of a cobra. A cobra decorated with a valuable jewel is more dangerous than one not decorated. Modern civilization is a patchwork of activities meant to cover the perpetual miseries of material existence. Such activities are aimed toward sense gratification. But above the senses is the mind, and above the mind is the intelligence, and above the intelligence there is the soul. Thus, the aim of real education should be self-realization, realization of the spiritual values of the soul. Any education which does not lead to such realization must be considered avidya, or nescience. By the culture of such nescience, one goes down to the darkest region of ignorance. Again, that's the purport to text number 9 of the Ishopanishad. Very straightforward. Krishna conscious education, indeed all education, should be towards delivering the living entity from repeated birth and death. In other words, uplifting them so that they're not completely overwhelmed by the drive of the material senses. Quote number 3. This is from the Nectar Devotion, page number 8. I really do appreciate that Jagadish Prabhu, who compiled this, was very specific on where he got these quotes from Srila Prabhupada. Nectar Devotion, page number 8. Srila Prabhupada writes, for example, a Krishna conscious boy, even if he is not very well educated by the university standard, can immediately give up all illicit sex, gambling, meat eating, and intoxication. Whereas those who are not in Krishna consciousness, although very highly educated, are often drunkards, meat eaters, sex mongers, and gamblers. It's interesting, and just a quick point. Srila Prabhupada is obviously talking about those devotees who are coming to Krishna consciousness in the 60s or 70s. I'm not quite sure when Srila Prabhupada finished translating the Nectar Devotion. I think it was the early 70s. But as we know, the history of ISKCON, a lot of young men and women were coming to Krishna consciousness, were coming to ISKCON. And they were often literally 16, 17-year-old, even younger, unfortunately, in some cases, because there's some unfortunate abuse that had happened. Be that as it may, but there were some very young adults in their late teens or early 20s who were coming to Krishna consciousness. Many of them had not had university education. And Srila Prabhupada is obviously talking about such persons who come to Krishna conscious, not necessarily academically advanced university in terms of university standards, but did wonderful, wonderful preaching work, wonderful service work to Srila Prabhupada and to the Krishna consciousness. And even to this day are still strong devotees in Krishna consciousness and are leading in terms of their exemplary spiritual lives. I remember this was in well, it was the early 2000s in Sweden. I was visiting for the Almvik Summer Festival. Almvik is one of ISKCON's farm communities in Sweden. And every summer they had a 1-week festival. And I was visiting for one of those festivals. And Ravindra Swarup Prabhu was there. And he was telling one of the stories, one of his pastimes with Srila Prabhupada. And I remember him saying that he was saying he had come to the temple. He was very young. He was in his early 20s, if that. He'd come to the temple and he was really excited, really fired up about joining the temple and being engaged in Krishna consciousness. And all the devotees, the leader of the temple at the time was telling, just move in, don't worry, just give up everything for Krishna, move into the ashram, so on and so forth. And Ravindra Swarup, I may have the details of the story wrong, but Ravindra Swarup apparently was doing that. And then he wrote to Srila Prabhupada, kind of introduced himself to Srila Prabhupada. And Ravindra Swarup Prabhu said Srila Prabhupada was the only one who told him to go back to university to get his degree. And I say that to say this. It is not that Srila Prabhupada did not want his disciples to get advanced degrees. It's oftentimes was pushed, at least in the early 80s and in the 70s and 80s, about the purpose of Gurukula education and what Srila Prabhupada wanted for his students. It was quite overemphasized that Srila Prabhupada did not expect or did not want his students, children, to go to university. And yes, that's there, but it's not like Srila Prabhupada did not understand the value. In other words, if there were students who were inclined towards that, as we see in the case of Ravindra Swarup Prabhu, Srila Prabhupada actually encouraged it. So there must be an understanding of what Srila Prabhupada, and I'm going to keep bringing this up because a lot of times devotees from that era say, well, Srila Prabhupada didn't want Gurukul students to go to university. And I think they take that out of context, because when I read through Srila Prabhupada's teachings, and I've read this book, Srila Prabhupada and Gurukul, I've read through it, and I kid you not, at least a dozen times over the 35, 40 years I've been wanting to be a Gurukul teacher and have been a Gurukul teacher in some shape, form, or fashion. Yes, there are those statements where Prabhupada said an 8th grade education is enough, but I must continue to reiterate that Srila Prabhupada was talking about a purpose. He wanted a specific purpose. And when he was talking about 8th grade education, he was talking about what was necessary for, in terms of what's required for a student to survive in life and yet be a strong devotee of Krishna. But in terms of whether or not the student is a, what's the word? Contributing member of society, that was always the key criteria, is that he wanted his disciples, his children, his Gurukul students to be known as contributing members of society. To be a contributing member of society in this day and age requires high school and a university degree. And that's the key focus. If we focus on what the essence of Srila Prabhupada's instruction, that he doesn't want his disciples to be known as fools, as uneducated. He wants his disciples to be impactful in society. Naturally, that means high school education and a university education. When Srila Prabhupada's talking about an 8th grade education, he's talking about that's what's essential for the person to academically to succeed in life. And this is actually something that is not out of the ordinary. Even now, there's actually here in the United States, there's a whole big, politically speaking, which is the field in which I work, there is talk about, forgiving college debt. And I spend a lot of time in my work, particularly now because this issue is front and center along with the abortion issue. I spend a lot of time listening to lectures and going to seminars and workshops on this particular issue. And in education, a lot of talk is about what is the use of a 4-year college degree. Now, it has its use, but at the same time, a lot of companies in this day and age do not require a 4-year degree. They require specific educational skills and attainment in a specific area. But a generalized 4-year degree is not always necessary to get a very good, well-paying job and to succeed. After entering a particular field with a certificate in a particular field, entering that field, on-the-job experience and education counts for more than a 4-year degree. This is 2022. This recognition, this acceptance it's actually becoming more widespread now. The recognition, this has been a trend for going on 2 decades now, but now it's actually being acknowledged openly that a 4-year college degree in some fields is absolutely necessary, but it may not have to be that case. In other words, a vocational certification in some particular specific field is often better than going to a 4-year degree, particularly in this day and age, if you're going to rack up $30,000 in debt. And Srila Prabhupada talked about vocational training. So Srila Prabhupada in many ways was ahead of his time by about, 5 decades now? 6 decades? When he was talking about vocational training. The same is being acknowledged and recognized even now. Not saying, again, Prabhupada it's not about a 4-year degree for the sake of a 4-year degree or not. It's about what's going to help the Vaishnava, the young Vaishnava devotee, be a contributing, leading member of society, whether it's an advanced degree or not. What is going to make a Vaishnava a leading, exemplary, contributing member of society? That's what is of primary importance. And then, of course, the foundation is always their Krishna conscious development and maturity. So let's finish this point. These are practical proofs of how, again, this is from Nectar Devotion, page 8. Prabhupada continues, these are practical proofs of how a Krishna conscious person becomes highly developed in good qualities, whereas a person who is not in Krishna consciousness cannot do so. In other words, cannot control their senses. We experience that even a young boy in Krishna consciousness is unattached to cinemas, nightclubs, naked dance shows, restaurants, liquor shops, etc. He becomes completely free. He saves his valuable time from being extravagantly spent in the way of smoking, drinking, attending the theater, and dancing. And this is Prabhupada's personal experience as he is bringing these young teenagers, 20-year-old men and women to Krishna consciousness, and they're giving up everything in the association of Srila Prabhupada and dedicating their life to Krishna. So Srila Prabhupada knows from firsthand experience how proper Krishna conscious education and support and empowerment can transform a person's life. Point number 4, or quote number 4, this is from Krishna Consciousness, the Matchless Gift, page 27. Srila Prabhupada writes, modern civilization is in dire need of an educational system to give people instructions on what happens after death. In actuality, the present educational system is not is most defective, because unless one knows what happens after death, one dies like an animal. That's a statement. There is, in the University of Virginia, they have a department devoted to the study of reincarnation. It was started off, I believe, in the 60s or 70s, by Ian Stevenson, Dr. Ian Stevenson. And he was a doctor of psychology, and he began devoting his time and research into scientifically researching reincarnation. And he has since passed on. But still, even today in the University of Virginia, forget the name of the department, they still study reincarnation. In the beginning, in the 70s and 80s, when Dr. Ian Stevenson who pioneered this research, he started off his research in the East, India, Thailand, Turkey, those realms and regions of the world that already had, culturally speaking, an acceptance of reincarnation. And in those areas, in those regions of the world, he found the most cases where children between the ages of 2 and 4 years old would have memories of a past life. And he began to document these cases. He documented over 2,000 cases in the East of these stories of these young children. They would recall very vivid memories from a past life. And Dr. Ian Stevenson, he would go and he would research these memories and verify what these children were talking about. Did they actually happen? And some of the stories are absolutely remarkable. You should, if you go on YouTube, and Google University of Virginia reincarnation research, and all of the research. Now the research is being carried on by, I believe, Professor Tim Jackson, I believe, is a current professor who's continuing this research in Virginia. And so Google it. There's some of the most fascinating research and information on reincarnation is being found there about essentially life after death, or certainly the fact that the scientific understanding. Of course, we know from Bhagavad Gita, we know reincarnation is easy to understand, but science is catching up to at least accepting the fact that it is a phenomena that is inexplicable. It cannot be explained by materialism. And that the cases that are being, and the interesting thing to bring up is, while Dr. Ian Stevenson was having a lot of success in the East, in cultures where the acceptance of reincarnation is the norm, Jim Tucker, that's the current Dr. Jim Tucker in the University of Virginia, who's carried on this research. In the past 20 years, they have been focusing on the US. And what they found is not that it was uncommon. It was simply that or not that it wasn't happening. It was simply that there was no way, because of the culture of the United States, people didn't talk about it, right? Being a Christian country, reincarnation, well, I wouldn't say it's a Christian country. I don't know. We won't get into that. That's a whole politically charged statement. But because America being what it was, let's put it that way, a lot of people, they had, families were having children who would have these memories of the past life, but their families would not bring it up because it was taboo. They would be seen as weird and so on and so forth. But as Dr. Jim Tucker began to research, and it's began through the internet, through social media, people can now go online, type in, my child is talking about being born in the 1940s. They can go online and research this stuff, and then they come across what the University of Virginia is doing. They contact Jim Tucker, and now it's become hundreds of thousands of cases, even in North America, of these children having memories of the past life. So it's no longer just about cultures who have a history or in a belief in reincarnation. It's actually understood that this is now a universal phenomenon, reincarnation. And it's not that all 2 to 4 year olds have this. It's certainly a few, very, very few, but it happens. And there are certain patterns that all of these cases, whether in the United States, Thailand, India, Turkey, wherever, they all have in common. They're always between 2 and 4 year old children. They all tend to forget or leave behind these memories at the ages of 5 and 6. They just stop bringing it up. It's no longer an issue. They move on, so to speak, unless the researcher continues to chase after them. A number of patterns are very interesting, like, the past life always happened to be based on, or the past life always ended violently. It was either a horrible accident or something kind of interrupted that past life. That is always the life that is remembered. In other words, the past life, the person died relatively young, in their 20s or 30s, or the past life, it was violent. Their end of life was violent. Those seems to be the ones where the memories carry over. There are very few memories, and I'd say that because it's been a while since I've spent time, listening to Dr. Jim Tucker in the University of Virginia, their research team. But very few cases where the memory was of someone who died when they were 80 years old and passed on peacefully in their sleep. Those are not the memories that are come into the next life. It's always a very young person in their 20s or 30s, and the death was violent or sudden and accidental, a drowning or something of a dramatic nature in that regard. Anyways, what does all of that have to do with Srila Prabhupada and Gurukula? And that was what Srila Prabhupada is saying here. Modern education needs to talk about life after death, life beyond death, because that changes two things. If two things that would change the world, and we've got one of them. The first is if aliens came from another planet and landed in Times Square. That would dramatically change everything we know about life, evolution, and everything, right? And reincarnation, actually. It's just that reincarnation is still, how many, you're hearing me now talking about what the University of Virginia has done. I did not know about this a year ago. I just thought reincarnation was something that was talked about in Vedanta, right? But the fact that there is scientific, deep, serious scientific research into reincarnation is actually quite amazing. In fact, the American Medical Association wrote in their journal about this research of the University of Virginia. And it's written in the journal. They are saying something to the effect that it is no longer possible for the scientific world to discount this phenomenon of remembering lives past. It's the evidence is just too, you can't ignore it anymore. And it's still not mainstream, the idea of reincarnation, in the sense that it's not openly talked about. It's not part of an accepted part of the human condition, as it were. And Srila Prabhupada says that Gurukula education is about that, because when we can talk about life after death, it immediately puts us into the realm of consciousness, because the body has died, right? There was one of the cases of a kid whose name was, I'm going to use the name James. I believe that was the name. He was, which is very interesting. This case, actually, there's a YouTube documentary on this. It's called Surviving Death. So if you have Netflix, go to Netflix and watch that documentary called Surviving Death. And there's some episodes that are a little, I think there's about 10 episodes. There's one episode, a 60-minute episode on reincarnation. That's the one I'm talking about. And they talk about what the University of Virginia is doing. The other 9 episodes are a little, watch it if you want. But anyways, there was this one child. What time is it? There was one child whose name was James, I believe. And at the age of 2 years old, which seems to be a common thread through all of these thousands upon thousands of cases across the world, he began talking about, first of all, he was always playing with an airplane, a model airplane, and he would always crash the airplane. And I'm burned up and I'm dead. And the parents, what do you mean you're burned up and you're dead? Oh, I died. My plane crashed and I died. And he was talking like this. And finally, the mother or the father, one of the two, researched reincarnation and brought in the University of Virginia. And they talked with this little James. He says, yeah, my last life, my name was also James, which was quite interesting. No, my last time I was James. And he says, I was a World War II pilot and I crashed my plane. And he gave the name of the aircraft carrier from which he flew, right? He gave the name of the aircraft carrier and he gave the name of his, if not his co-pilot, I think he gave the name of his wingman because, air fighter pilots, they fly in flights of 4, a lead pilot and a wingman and another lead pilot and a wingman. So I think he named his wingman, who also died as well. But anyway, so he named a few things, the aircraft carrier, his wingman, he gave his own name. Anyways, they did the research and they found that certainly, sure enough, there was a Lieutenant something James who flew off this aircraft carrier and who died in the Battle of Midway or Iwo Jima, and he had a wingman with the name that this child had given. Anyways, I say all that to say this, to reiterate the purpose that Srila Prabhupada identified of Gurukula education. Srila Prabhupada did not want Gurukula education just for the disciples, just for his disciples' children. He literally and quite specifically said anyone who wants to have their children educated in our Gurukulas, our education should be of such a high standard that the best families will want to send their children to our Gurukulas. Srila Prabhupada wanted that standard for his Gurukulas, and so that when we can have this discussion about life and consciousness, then the very next question is that if we can recognize there's existence beyond materialism, then the next question is, and I was listening to another seminar by Dr. Jim Tucker on reincarnation. He was saying it's completely changed his own view of existence, because now existence is now beyond the material plane. It's incontrovertible. I don't want to say scientific evidence, but there's obviously an existing phenomena that is beyond the material plane. That opens up, that changes the game, that changes everything about our human existence. That's the purpose of Gurukula. So I'll read one more point by Srila Prabhupada, then we'll wrap this up. Point number 5, quote number 5, this is taken from, again, Krishna Consciousness, the Matchless Gift, paragraph 41 and 42. Srila Prabhupada writes, unfortunately, at present, people are educated in such a way that they do not believe in the next life. Indeed, it seems that the more educated one becomes, educated are in air quotes, the less he or she believes in God, in God's law, in the next life, and in sinful and pious activities. Thus, modern education is simply preparing men to become animals. If there is no education to teach a human being what he is and whether or not he is this body, he becomes no better than an ass. Srila Prabhupada has a very powerful way of wording things. So we'll end there. It's a wonderful reading Srila Prabhupada's views. I always, I'm so happy that I got this book from Burijan Prabhu back in the 1990s. Burijan Prabhu gave me that book. And I've always been diving into it ever since to get Srila Prabhupada's view on education and Gurukula in particular. So we'll end there. And we, again, every Thursday, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we read from Srila Prabhupada and Gurukula. You can type your comments into the chat. I can read the chat and we can have a discussion back and forth because this is obviously given live. We can discuss on various issues. So share this link, subscribe, hit the subscribe button, and share this so we can continue this reading of Srila Prabhupada and Gurukula and discussing what it means and how to restart. Because let's be honest, ISKCON, we have failed in establishing Gurukula as Srila Prabhupada instructed and desired. So we'll end there. Hari Hari.